Live from London, this is BBC News. The bodies of 6 people taken hostage by Hamas have been recovered by Israeli forces in a tunnel under the city of Rafah. Meanwhile, the mass rollout of polio vaccines is beginning in Gaza. Humanitarian agencies aiming to vaccinate more than 600,000 children over the coming days. Voters in eastern Germany head to the polls, the far right eyeing big gains in the region, a litmus test for next year's federal election. And a medical trial which could save lives, the personalised cancer vaccine, which is offering new hope to patients. Hello and welcome, I'm Luxmy Gopal. Well, let's start in Gaza, where the Israeli military has confirmed that 6 bodies found in a tunnel in the city of Rafah were those of hostages held by Hamas after the October the 7th attack. It's named them as Israelis Alexander Lobanov, Almog Sarusi, Eden Yerushalmi, Ori Danino, Carmel Gat and Hirsch Goldberg Polin, who was an American citizen. He had appeared in a Hamas video with an amputated arm a few months ago. In a statement, President Biden called his death tragic and reprehensible, saying Hamas leaders will pay for their crimes. The Missing Families Forum has again urged Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to agree to a ceasefire for the release of the remaining hostages. Elsewhere, 3 Israelis have died after their vehicle was fired on near the city of Hebron in the occupied West Bank. Well, with me now is Mohamed Taha from BBC Arabic. Mohamed, let's start first of all with the news of the bodies of 6 hostages that have been found. What more do we know about the operation in order to be able to find them and recover those bodies?
So the operation was to secure just a tunnel where the Israeli forces found an alive hostage last week, Al-Qadi, a Bedouin hostage. So the Israeli forces was just trying to clear the tunnel and they found the bodies there. So they didn't go there upon an intelligence information or something. They just found them while they are searching the tunnel. So the circumstances around the killing, so the Israeli, there is exchange of accusations. The Israeli army saying that Hamas killed them intentionally, and the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu just issued a statement a few minutes ago saying that we will continue to free all hostages and Israel will not rest until we reach the killers. Means, you know, he's inciting that the military operation in Gaza would continue. But Hamas issued also a statement and they said that they were killed in an Israeli shelling, and they said that what they described as practicing genocide in Gaza and the support of President Biden to Israel, as they said, is the cause of the death of these hostages. So there is this exchange of accusation between 2 parties.
And how much does this add pressure onto the Prime Minister? We heard there the comment from the Hostages Families Forum. They've also said that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu should take responsibility for abandoning the hostages.
Indeed, today is a big day for Israel. In Israel, as is Sunday, and everybody came from the Sabbath. We saw in the evening last evening a big demonstration asking the Prime Minister Netanyahu to strike a deal. There is a call by the families of the hostages for a general strike in Israel. There is already strike in the secondary school. It's supposed to start today and it did not start. And they are calling the labor syndicates or unions to call for a wide strike to try and make this moment where they found the bodies of these hostages a turning point to try to convince the Israeli government to do some action. The Israeli Prime Minister cancelled the annual the weekly meeting of the Israeli government that's happening every Sunday morning. he cancelled this meeting, and there will be a meeting on 4 p.m. local time to address the issue. This meeting was called by the Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, who was vocal about his disagreement with the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in his approach of insisting of having permanent military presence of the Israeli forces in Gaza. So the situation now in the Israeli territories is really in high tension, and as you mentioned, there is also a tension in the West Bank and in Gaza.
Well, Mohamed, stay with us. We'll come back to you in a moment, but let's now go live to Jerusalem and to our Middle East correspondent, John Donnison. John, we were talking there about the divisions in Benjamin Netanyahu's cabinet. How much does this latest development add to that?
Well, I think Mohamed's right. It reflects the divisions within the government, but also the divisions within Israeli society. Benjamin Netanyahu, in his short statement this morning, said those who kill hostages do not want a deal, referring to the allegation from the Israeli military that these hostages were brutally murdered, in their words, by Hamas shortly before the bodies were found. You have to remember, though, that back in November last year, we had a ceasefire, temporary ceasefire, where hostages were being exchanged for Palestinian prisoners every day. That went on for about a week, with roughly 10 hostages a day coming out. And a lot of questions being asked about why didn't Israel continue with that process for a longer period, and then some of those who we now know have died might have been freed. There's certainly the Hostage Families Forum saying today that the people whose bodies have been found today would have been alive today if a hostage deal could have been done.
And we have heard reports, haven't we, of Mr. Netanyahu's defense minister disagreeing with him as well, and accusing him of putting his emphasis on deploying IDF in the Philadelphia corridor over the hostages. What more can you tell us about that?
Yeah, well, the last time the Security Cabinet met earlier this week, there are reports of a shouting match between Yoav Gallant and Prime Minister Netanyahu. Yoav Gallant saying that this insistence on leaving Israeli forces in the Philadelphia corridor, that's the border area between Gaza and Egypt, was blocking a deal. That is something that Mr. Netanyahu has insisted he is going to pursue and continue with. You have to remember that within his government, there are also more hardline elements who want Israel to be doing more militarily and have said they will resign from the government, bringing the government down if a ceasefire deal is done. And I'm talking about Itamar Ben-Gvir, the hardline national security minister, and also the finance minister, Mr. Smotrich, who have said they will pull out of the government. So he is torn, Mr. Netanyahu, as he has been now for months, of trying to keep his government together, but also the pressure building for a ceasefire deal, not just from diplomats, but also from Israeli citizens, and in particular those hostage families.
And John, we have also been hearing about 3 Israelis who've been killed after their vehicle was fired on near the city of Hebron. What's the latest on that?
Yes, well, you'll be aware, Luxmy, that for the past 4 or 5 days there have been intensified Israeli military operations in the north of the West Bank targeting Palestinian militants. At least 20 people have been killed in those raids and strikes on Palestinian cities, and Israel says it's trying to protect its citizens from attacks. Well, in the south of the West Bank, near Hebron, which is the biggest Palestinian city in the occupied West Bank, 3 Israeli police officers were killed in a shooting attack overnight on their car, and we've not got the details of their names yet, but certainly that is another dangerous development in the West Bank, which the warning is that there could be a war in the West Bank similar to what has been happening in Gaza for the past 10 or 11 months.
John, thank you. That's our Middle East correspondent, John Donnison, live in Jerusalem for us. Well, UN officials and local health workers are preparing to roll out a mass vaccination programme for polio in Gaza, which will rely on a series of limited pauses in fighting between Israeli forces and Hamas. The World Health Organization says it will need to vaccinate at least 90% of children aged under 10 for the campaign to succeed. Its campaign was organised after a 10-month-old baby was partly paralysed by the first case of the virus in Gaza in a quarter of a century. On Saturday, medics vaccinated children at one hospital in a symbolic move ahead of the official campaign. From Jerusalem, our Middle East correspondent Yolanda Nell reports.
Just 2 drops. As the UN begins vaccinating against polio in Gaza, a dose is easy to give. But carrying out a mass immunisation campaign in a combat zone is a huge challenge. Parents of the first vaccinated children are relieved.
I was worried and afraid because this is scary, the polio disease. This disease makes the children unable to move.
Baby Abdul Rahman was crawling early, but now his mum worries he'll never be able to walk. He was the first child found to have polio in Gaza in 25 years, and it paralysed his leg. Because of the war, he wasn't vaccinated, and now medical care is limited.
Aboud wants to live and be treated. He wants to live and walk like other children. I feel a lot of guilt that he didn't get the vaccination, but I couldn't give it to him because of our circumstances.
Displaced 5 times, the baby's family now lives in a crowded tent camp in Deir al-Balah in central Gaza. Raw sewage flows through streets nearby. Conditions are ideal for diseases to spread, especially polio, which is highly infectious. Since discovering the virus, UN agencies have been racing to set up an emergency mass vaccination programme. And with war raging, they've negotiated 3 localised 3-day pauses in fighting with Israel and Hamas. UN officials say the plan is not ideal, but it's workable. With no end in sight to the war, the hope is that at least one new source of suffering can be eliminated. Yolanda Nell, BBC News, Jerusalem.
Well, still with me is my colleague Mohamed Taha from BBC Arabic. Mohamed, we are seeing some live images now of the vaccination rollout actually underway. We're seeing images from a hospital in Deir al-Balah where babies and children are receiving the polio vaccinations. How significant is this in what was potentially a humanitarian crisis with the outbreak of polio?
It is very significant. It is a very happy moment where we see some kind of normality of life in Gaza, where children were going to hospital to have vaccination. It is very, very delightful moment in the midst of all the wars that's happening in the West Bank, in Israel, and in the northern of Israel. And funnily enough, or I don't know, it's not funnily, it's hard to describe, but not too far from this location in Al-Brej refugee camp, there were Israeli shelling, and 1 person at least were killed, and there were a shelling and a Shuja'iyya in eastern Gaza, and 1 person at least killed. But people are really adamant, as you can see, the 2,000 workers from the local health authority in Gaza, and with the cooperation of the World Health Organization and the UNICEF and the UN officials, 2,000 people are really determined to have this campaign successful as a successful event.
Well, Mohamed, thank you. That's my colleague Mohamed Taha from BBC Arabic. Well, let's return to the main news that Israel says bodies of 6 hostages have been recovered from Gaza. Let's speak now to Jotam Confino, who's correspondent for The Telegraph, who